So we move now to the next speaker. Raising either. So as you can see in the program, we are very delighted to have Dariush as the next speaker, who kindly accepted to speak in this DNSG, but remotely from the house. So we will see him coming. So he is a cardiologist for the Health and director of the Medicine Institute and First University in Boston, and also has as professor of medicine and also recognized leader in science of nutrition, cardiometabolic diseases, policy, disease writing, and so many papers cited. One of the top scientists actually do. And I'm delighted to give the floor to him. Please, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. I'm ready to start.
You may start.
Okay, so thank you for having me speak virtually. Apologies, I could not be there in person to be with you. I think my talk builds very nicely on the talk of the speaker just before me. So I'm going to continue really talking about dairy foods and type 2 diabetes. I'm going to mention cardiovascular disease because, of course, cardiovascular disease is relevant to type 2 diabetes as well, and really talk about health effects and emerging biological pathways. And so, as we've thought about heart disease conventionally, this has been the conventional focus that total fat and saturated fat raises LDL and total cholesterol and leads to heart disease. And that's based on fairly simplistic studies. And I think we know now that this is overly simplified. And I think that was shown by the last speaker, that we can't group all of saturated fat together or all foods together. We have to think in a much more nuanced fashion. And similarly, as we've thought about diabetes, this is still what most of the world policy is focused on, getting people to have less fat, less calories, less sugar, thinking about energy out, and obesity as though humans were just buckets with calories being poured in the top and calories coming out the bottom, rather than really understanding that our bodies are complex physiology, and food is not just about energy. Food is biologic information that alters many physiologic pathways in our bodies. And so just like the heart disease paradigm I just showed you is overly simplified, this obesity and diabetes paradigm, just focused on calories in and calories out, is also oversimplified. And yet this is what is driving policy. And so in the United Kingdom, there's the front of pack traffic light label, which focuses on fat, saturated fat, sugars, and salts, rather than looking at the whole food and its entire health effects. In Chile and many other Latin American countries, a similar approach, which I think is mostly a mistake, with the exception of some additives like salt. I don't think this is the right focus for thinking about nutrition. And why do we have this focus on single nutrients? Why do we try to guide people around nutrients? It really comes down to the birth of modern nutrition science, which was really not that long ago, about 100 years ago, in the 1920s and 1930s. Vitamins were discovered. We have to remember that the word vitamin wasn't even invented until 1912. It was 1912 that Casimir Funk, a Polish biochemist, even invented the theoretical concept of vitamins in 1912. And the first vitamin that was isolated and synthesized was vitamin C in 1932. And so less than 100 years ago. And so all of the nutrition focus from 1930 until about 1960 was entirely on a handful of vitamins. And then, of course, that was combined with the booming world population. After World War II, the population grew dramatically by about 3 billion people. And so to feed the world's population, we had to greatly increase the production of calories. And so we focused really on calories and vitamins for most of the 20th century. And that nutrient focus has really influenced our dietary guidelines, in particular around dairy. Fortunately, there's been an explosion of nutrition science since those early periods. And if you look at the science of the 1960s or 1970s, what compared to now, what this chart shows is the number of scientific publications in every decade from 1960 to 2020 on these different topics. And you can see the science is exploding. And so we know so much more now than we even knew 20 years ago about the effects of foods, and including dairy. And what are some of the things we know? Well, first, we know that dietary fats are probably the single most bioactive macronutrient in the food supply. Carbohydrates are fairly simple, just a few different sugars that go together to form carbohydrates. Proteins are fairly simple in how they're metabolized and what they do in the body. Dietary fats are unbelievably complicated and interesting. And so grouping all fats together, even grouping all saturated fats together, and trying to understand their health effects is really a big mistake, because dietary fats are incredibly complex molecules that change the fluidity of our membranes, interact with our membrane proteins and ion channels to change receptor function, directly regulate gene expression, and get metabolized into bioactive molecules. And so through these different pathways, there's a range of very interesting and complicated effects. And so when we look at saturated fat, saturated fat from all different foods is not created equal. And the findings that were shown in the recent presentation before mine have been shown previously. This is a paper from 12 years ago, essentially showing the same thing, that if you look at saturated fat from meat versus saturated fat from dairy, saturated fat from meat is associated with higher risk of cardiovascular disease. Saturated fat from dairy is actually associated with lower risk of cardiovascular disease. And so obviously their exchange would be beneficial. And saturated fat from butter and from plant sources just was not consumed enough to make any really strong inference. We actually consume very little saturated fat from plant sources or from butter. The majority is from meat sources and dairy. And so these foods have different effects and should not be considered the same. And I don't think there should be a blanket recommendation to reduce saturated fat to below 10% of calories. It depends on the food source, and it also depends on the content of unsaturated fat in the diet. If somebody has a very high total fat intake with very high unsaturated fat intake, they can consume more saturated fat. If their saturated fat is from dairy, they can consume more saturated fat. So I think a blanket recommendation to consume saturated fat below a certain level is not justified by the science. Now, why might dairy and meats have different effects? Well, the saturated fats are different. And so this chart shows you the average fatty acid profile of dairy versus beef. Of course, there are some differences between different types of dairy, different types of beef, but on average, this is the differences. And what you can see is the biggest difference is that about almost 40% of dairy fat is from 14 carbon or smaller saturated fatty acids. So 14, 12, 10, 8, 6, and 4 carbon saturated fats. These include the medium chain and short chain triglycerides, and there's interesting evidence that medium chain and short chain saturated fats could actually be beneficial for metabolic health. So this is one very clear potential explanation why dairy would have a different effect than meat on cardiovascular disease. And as has been shown, and this has been shown many times, dairy foods on average are either neutral or beneficial for risk of cardiovascular disease. This is a meta-analysis published many years ago. The findings have not really changed. And cheese in particular, and yogurt in particular, seem to be potentially beneficial. Now, let's move from cardiovascular disease to weight gain, because there's been a lot of focus on the calories from dairy fat. And so that's led to focus on low-fat dairy. But is there really empiric evidence that the type of dairy makes a difference for weight gain? And so what this graphic shows is the weight gain associated with a change in one serving of these different foods over 4 years, the long-term weight gain when people increase or decrease any of these foods. And this is based on 120,000 adults in 3 separate cohorts followed for 24 years. And all the findings are multivariable adjusted. Positive values mean that for increased intake, people gain more weight. Negative values mean for increased intake, people gained less weight. And then the important thing we did in this paper is we said, how do these foods relate to weight gain depending on what's done with carbohydrate? in this case, measured by glycemic load. So if these foods are replacing carbohydrate, if these foods are neutral with respect to carbohydrate, or if these foods are consumed with carbohydrate, does it influence their weight gain? And so let's go through and look at some examples. So let's start with red meat and processed meats. The blue is if these foods are consumed with carbohydrate, what happens? Red is if these foods are consumed and no change in carbohydrate. And green is if these foods are consumed in place of carbohydrate. And what we see is that for red meat and processed meats, the more that's consumed on average over time, there's actually weight gain, but that this weight gain is less if it's replacing carbohydrates. So if people consume red meat and replace carbohydrates, the weight gain is less, but there's still weight gain with red meat consumption. For poultry, it's pretty neutral unless poultry replaces carbohydrate, and then there's modest weight loss. Seafood, generally associated with weight loss, but if you replace carbohydrate, associated with more weight loss. Eggs is interesting. If you eat eggs with carbohydrate, which most people do, associated with weight gain, but if you replace carbohydrate, associated with weight loss, and so on. But let's look at the dairy foods. And so yogurt, interestingly, was by far the most powerful inverse associations with weight gain. Lower weight, the more yogurt is consumed. And also, interestingly, there's no difference whether the yogurt is replacing carbohydrate or not replacing carbohydrate. And when we looked at sweetened yogurt versus unsweetened yogurt, even sweetened yogurt was associated with relative weight loss, although about half of the benefit was lost. And so even sweetened yogurt was associated again with weight loss, but about half the size. So that's quite interesting. Yogurt inversely associated with weight gain, no interaction with carbohydrate intake. Milk, interestingly, has no association with weight gain, not higher or lower. And there's no difference between whole fat and low fat milk, and also no difference, no interaction with carbohydrate. And so this suggests that whole fat dairy, low fat dairy, really no major association or difference with weight gain. And then lastly, cheese, quite interestingly, looks like eggs. If people eat cheese with bread, with crackers, in sandwiches, then the cheese itself, independently of the bread, is associated with weight gain, suggesting an interaction. But if people eat cheese as a replacement for carbohydrate, it's actually associated with weight loss. And so, what these findings highlight first is that the dairy fat content doesn't seem to be related to weight gain. And that more importantly, it's the type of food, the type of dairy. We can't just group dairy together. We have to separately think about milk, yogurt, and cheese as different foods with different biologic effects. And the other thing we have to think about is, as I mentioned now, is the total carbohydrate intake and the total fat intake. And so this is a very nice randomized controlled trial looking at blood lipid risk factors in relation to carbohydrate intake, saturated fat intake, and unsaturated fat intake. And they looked at 3 different outcomes here: LDL cholesterol, lipoprotein little a, and an index called the lipoprotein insulin resistance score, which takes into account things like triglyceride levels, HDL levels, LDL particle size, and is really a measure of sort of atherogenic dyslipidemia. And so you really have atherogenic dyslipidemia, lipoprotein little a, and LDL cholesterol. Let's look at what they found looking at different levels of fat and unsaturated fat. So all of the diets raised LDL cholesterol and actually raised it pretty similarly. And these diets have very different levels of saturated fat. Look, one of the low-fat diet has only 7% saturated fat. The high-fat diet had 21% saturated fat. But even with this incredible difference of 7% to 21% saturated fat, the LDL change was the same. There was no difference in the increase in LDL. Why? Because the unsaturated fat intake also went up in the high-fat group. And so again, this returns to the point I made earlier. There is no evidence to recommend less than 10% calories from saturated fat. What's important is the ratio of unsaturated to saturated fat. If the ratio is constant, the health effect is constant. And so that's the effect on LDL cholesterol. But interestingly, while the LDL cholesterol effect is constant, if the ratio is constant, the more saturated fat and unsaturated fat is consumed, lipoprotein little a is reduced the most in the low carb, high fat group. And so high saturated fat lowers lipoprotein little a, and this has been seen before. And then high fat diets, high saturated fat, high unsaturated fat diets also lower atherogenic dyslipidemia, whereas low fat, low fat, low saturated fat diets, high in carb, raise atherogenic dyslipidemia. And so what this study shows very, very nicely is if we want to think about metabolic risk, we should be eating low carb, high fat diets with good ratios of unsaturated to saturated fat. And so let's move on and look at body composition. I've showed you that dairy consumption, milk consumption in particular, is relatively neutral for long-term weight gain, and randomized trials have generally shown the same thing, that BMI does not change significantly in randomized controlled trials of dairy. But interestingly, body composition does change. And so BMI, of course, is just your weight. It doesn't measure fat versus muscle. And so this meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, published now 12 years ago, and the findings haven't changed, shows that in randomized controlled trials, people who eat more dairy have decreased fat mass and increased lean body mass. And so weight alone isn't the best measure of the health effects of dairy on weight, because we have to think of body composition. And when we look at risk of diabetes, this has been mentioned before, what's very interesting is fermented dairy in particular seems to be associated with low risk of diabetes, both yogurt and cheese, whereas milk seems to be fairly neutral. And so what this chart shows is the relative risk of diabetes across quintiles of milk consumption, yogurt consumption, and cheese consumption. You can see across quintiles, milk is neutral, yogurt appears beneficial, and cheese has a significantly lower risk. And I think this raises these issues of probiotics and fermentation. This is another paper, again, consistent with the recent results that were shown in the prior presentation, looking at food sources of saturated fat and risk of diabetes. And what's interesting is red meat is associated with higher risk. Saturated fat from red meat is associated with higher risk of diabetes. Saturated fat from, excuse me, this is not saturated fat. This is the actual intake of the food. So red meat per serving, excuse me, is associated with higher risk. Interestingly, low-fat milk is associated with a higher risk of cardiovascular disease, and low-fat dairy trending towards higher risk of cardiovascular disease. But whole-fat dairy, lower risk, fermented milk, lower risk, and cheese a trend toward lower risk. So again, suggesting that there's something about fermentation and that dairy fat itself is not harmful. Now, many studies have looked at probiotics that are in yogurt and also in some cheeses. There's active probiotics. This is an animal experiment, and this is an animal experiment, one of the first to look at probiotics and weight gain in a rat model. And what was so interesting about this study is they found that giving probiotics to the rats reduced weight gain in a rat model of obesity, with less fat in their fat pads, less fat in their subcutaneous fat. But what's fascinating to me about this study is that there were no changes in calorie intake. The rats did not gain weight, but their calorie intake was the same. So this really makes the very strong point that our microbiome changes our energy expenditure and changes the host microbiome partitioning of energy. And so we really have to move beyond thinking about total calories, because even without changing total calories, how we change our gut microbiome can change our likelihood to gain weight or lose weight. And this has been seen now in randomized trials in humans. This is a meta-analysis of probiotics and weight change, about 1,000 total subjects across these trials. And in randomized controlled trials, eating probiotics, whether in food or as supplements, significantly reduces BMI and significantly reduces weight. This is a separate meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials of glycemic control, about 1,100 total subjects. Randomized controlled trials, probiotics, lower fasting glucose, lower fasting insulin, and lower home insulin resistance. And so we know that probiotics are good for our metabolism. And then lastly, I just want to end, and I just want to talk about dairy fat some more. And dairy fat is so interesting and so complicated. It's even beyond the type of saturated fat and the type of saturated fatty acids. We have to think about the structure and the phospholipids and the sphingolipids. And in particular, we have to think about milk fat globule membrane. Milk fat globule membrane is the natural layer here shown in green of phospholipids and sphingolipids that solubilizes the fat droplets in dairy fat naturally. And so this is whipped cream. Whipped cream has intact milk fat globule membrane. Butter, in contrast, to make butter, you have to get rid of the milk fat globule membrane. You have to throw away these phospholipids and sphingolipids. How do you do that? Through buttermilk. Buttermilk is actually the phospholipids and sphingolipids from milk fat globule membrane that you have to remove to make butter. And so butter does not have milk fat globule membrane. And what's so interesting is many studies of the older studies from the 1980s and 1990s, the randomized controlled trials that looked at dairy and risk factors used butter. They used butter. They didn't use milk. They didn't use cheese. They didn't use yogurt. They didn't use whipped cream. And so butter does not have milk fat globule membrane. Now that's really important because milk fat globule membrane changes the lipid response of consuming dairy fat. And so this is a randomized controlled trial published now 8 years ago, comparing equal amounts of fat and saturated fat from whipped cream versus butter. And you can see after several weeks in this randomized controlled trial, people who consume butter had increases in total cholesterol, increases in LDL cholesterol, increases in ApoB. But people who consumed whipped cream, which had the natural intact milk fat globule membrane, had no increase in LDL cholesterol. And so we've been talking about dairy fat and saturated fat raising LDL cholesterol, but we've been ignoring milk fat globule membrane. And there's a nice follow-up paper that was done out of France looking at cream cheese, 100 grams per day without milk fat globule membrane, with 3 grams per 100 gram of milk fat globule membrane, or with 5 grams per 100 gram of milk fat globule membrane. And what was shown in this nice randomized controlled trial is when you have more milk fat globule membrane, more milk polar lipids, you get significantly reductions in LDL cholesterol, ApoB, and triglycerides. And so at the end of the day, we really have to think much more holistically about dairy. I'll lastly show this recent paper we published a few years ago looking at dairy fat biomarkers and risk of diabetes. This is looking at blood biomarkers of dairy fat, odd chain saturated fats, and natural trans fat across 16 prospective cohorts from 12 countries, totaling more than 64,000 participants. And so we're not asking them what they ate, we're looking at blood biomarkers of dairy fat. And what we found is after adjusting for other risk factors, people who consume more dairy fat, which is mostly from cheese, have lower risk of diabetes, a significantly lower risk of diabetes. So at the end of the day, when we think about dairy, we cannot think about calories when we think about obesity. We can't judge a food's obesogenicity by its calorie count. And so recommending whole fat dairy or low fat dairy because of calories doesn't make any sense. We have to think far beyond obesity. We have to think about the microbiome, blood lipids, glucose insulin, homeostasis, systemic inflammation. Obesity is not, at the end of the day, and even blood lipids at the end of the day are not the most important thing. We have to look at the whole effect of the food. And we have to really understand all of the complex biologic pathways. I think we're at very, very early days in understanding dairy and health. I don't think we have a good understanding yet of all of the effects. And so I think if I were to sum it up, I think that, at the top of the food pyramid, the foods we should be consuming the most are still fruits and nuts and fish and vegetables and plant oils. But I would put yogurt up there as a healthful food with active probiotics. I would also put cheese higher than other minimally processed animal foods, given that it's fermented and seems to be linked to lower risk of stroke and diabetes. Milk, poultry, eggs, butter seem to be pretty neutral. There's foods that are healthier, there's foods that are worse. But I think it depends on what you're consuming in place of milk to judge its health effects. So thank you. I was pleased to speak with you and look forward to the discussion.